if you did want to try and identify, minimize, and kind of work through recency bias, I think first off you just need to make sure that you're open-minded.
My name is Katharina, and I'm the Community and Event Manager at eCulture, a company that is on a mission to shape the world of unbiased hiring. Welcome to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. On today's episode of the Oops, I'm Biased podcast, I am speaking to my colleague Annie Russell. She's part of the product team, and I'm really excited to be speaking to her about recency bias. This is another one of our Bias Deep Dives episodes, and I'm really excited to be speaking to her about the effect that recency bias has on the recruitment process and how you can minimize that, along with some really great real-world examples that I think we can all learn from, and also just see how much of an impact recency bias can have. So without further ado, I hope you enjoyed this episode. All right, welcome back to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. This is another one of our bias deep dives. This is a little mini series that we're doing on the podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Annie Russell. She is a dear colleague of mine, and we're going to cover recency bias in recruitment today. Annie, it's so great to have you.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm super excited to talk about the biases and hopefully everyone can learn a bit more. But I am a product owner at eCulture, and so some of my references might be a bit product related, a bit about the product, a bit about software and that kind of universe. But super excited to talk about recruitment and the challenges there as well.
Yeah, in this little mini series, we always try to bring in examples from the real world, a little more practical than just recruitment, to really make sure that we all understand how subtle but also insidious the impact of specific biases can be. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your examples, both in recruitment and also product potentially. Why don't we start all the way at the beginning and talk a little bit about the definition of recency bias? What exactly is it?
Yeah, thanks. I think recency bias is a bit of an interesting one to me. It's certainly quite a common bias that I think you'd experience a lot in life. Specifically, it's a bias that makes you more prone to remembering the events or things that have happened the most recently. There's a few different types of biases that have that kind of effect. It's quite similar to primacy bias, which has you more prone to remembering things that happened first. But yeah, this is the opposite. It kind of is that thing that happened the most recent. So you're just more prone to having that influence your judgment or your decision making, because it's the thing that is the most fresh in your mind and really familiar for you.
Yeah, I think we can all it can resonate with all of us, that feeling of, oh, what just happened, we just have clearer in our mind. It's just, as you said, fresher in our minds. Would you have an example of sort of either day-to-day or personal life where this really comes into play?
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly in product it happens a lot. And I think when we're thinking about it, really have to think about how the human brain kind of processes things. And so we often reduce events and things that happen to the real key elements. And it gets difficult for your brain to remember everything and be able to make efficient decisions. And especially as the world gets more complex, it's really hard to try and remember things. So we try to remember the important bits. And so, for me, I think a very common product feedback is that when you're talking to users and getting feedback on a problem and you're getting, really into solving it, you tend to remember that last conversation that you had. And that really can impact how you prioritize or what feature you might think is the biggest impact or has the most importance, to try and focus on that last thing. I think that's certainly a common a common example for me. But yeah.
Yeah. While I was prepping for this episode, I was also sort of thinking about, okay, where do I see primacy bias or recency bias come into play a lot? You were talking about feedback. I think this also sticks out to me as sort of the, I think for all of us, this episode might come a few weeks after, but I think we're all sort of in the performance review, annual review phase where you'd have a conversation with your direct manager or with your direct reports. And then what sticks out the most is the last piece of feedback, and whether that's positive or negative can then really influence how you view how that conversation went and how your performance is going, or the other way around, how you're doing as a manager. So I think sort of that is sort of a work example, I think that we can all very much relate to.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have an example out of sort of day-to-day or personal life that came up for you where you think, I don't know, maybe consumer choices, the way that we, I don't know, go about the world, anything that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so at the moment we're renovating our house. So heaps and heaps of decisions that need to be made all the time. And I'm sure, say for the chairs that we're buying or the cabinets that we chose, there's definitely a lot of, I think, recency bias that comes into it, just too many choices, information overload, and it becomes much easier to choose to go with the thing that is most recent to you and most familiar. Even if maybe it's more expensive or it's not quite exactly what you wanted, you have that bias of it's the thing that you remember the most.
Yeah, it's a bit of it, what probably comes into it as well is a bit of choice paralysis. There's just so much to choose from that you then go with, as you say, the most familiar, the most fresh in mind. I would love to talk a bit about examples in the recruitment process where recency bias is most prominent. What do you have for us there?
Yeah, I think there's, as we've been mentioning quite a few times, I think there's a lot of places where recency bias comes into play. And so I will mention a few different phases. First, the application phase, definitely. So if you are reviewing CVs or reviewing candidates, the hiring manager or the recruiter has the bias of having more memory of the first, the last few candidates. You remember the last few candidates a lot better than you remember the first ones. And so they're actually much more likely to be invited for an interview. And it's just because your brain short-term memory can't really can't cope with all of that information, so it needs to filter out and skim through, prioritize. So yeah, I think there's that one, very much more likely to invite the last applicants. And then in the interview phase, it can even happen on more of a short-term basis. So even over that half an hour interview, maybe that candidate has made a good impression, showed up on time, answers those first few questions really strongly. But when you're talking about that candidate later, the ones that you actually remember are the last questions they answered, and maybe they didn't perform as well in those questions. And then that really kind of can skew your opinion on that candidate, even though overall they've probably done a really good job. And then even past that into the selection phase, you, out of the candidates that you interviewed, maybe it's spread out over a week, maybe 2 weeks. You also can experience that recency bias by remembering best the candidate that you talked to last or second last in the last couple of days, and choosing to favour those candidates because the interview was easier to remember, even though they might not be the better candidates. It's easier for your brain to remember and to be able to prioritize those most recent conversations.
Yeah, so it really spans sort of the whole recruitment journey from starting with applications, remembering that once they came in last, the best, sort of picking those out for interviews up until choosing who to extend an offer to, because that might be the last person that you interviewed, so you have them fresh in mind, and they also answered the last few questions the best. out of the sort of the whole lot, at least from your memory. That sounds like a big feat to actually then minimize the impact of recency bias. What would you advise recruiters and HR professionals do to minimize the impact? Because it sounds like has quite a tight grip on your decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's important to think that to realize that it is impossible to eliminate the bias completely. But if you did want to try and identify, minimize, and kind of work through recency bias, I think first off, you just need to make sure that you're open-minded, be aware of the bias, be aware that you have that preference, and yeah, be ready to kind of fight that bias and go against that gut feeling. And so training and awareness as well throughout the team and throughout your hiring managers and the recruiters is really important. And I think that really applies to all biases. But I guess some other things that can really impact the recency bias is trying to standardize things. So having more standardized criteria and evaluation to try and minimize the amount that you're relying on your memory to interpret and ensure that each candidate is objectively assessed. And make sure that criteria is also specific for the role you're hiring for, so that you know that you can rely on it and that you can use it. Other than that, I think, really, really preparing yourself for the fact that you know that you won't have that memory of those earlier candidates. And whether that's using tips like taking notes or recording the interview and having somebody else review those notes and provide an opinion, or even providing some scores or kind of notes during the interview on the candidate with the candidate, so that you can so you're not waiting till the end of the day and only remembering part of the interview. They can really help. But I think the other bonus of a lot of these tips is that this recency bias really comes into play because of your short-term memory and because you have a lot of information to process. So implementing these tips can also help just to reduce that cognitive load that your brain's going through. Whenever you're under stress or you have lots of different factors impacting you, it can make these biases a lot worse. So just trying to remove the amount that you're relying on your memory as much as you can.
Yeah, that's actually a great sort of twofold bonus that you get. You, on the one hand, are a lot more objective and give every candidate an equal opportunity to showcase their skills and make a hiring decision based on more objective parameters. But you're also saying, well, you can make your life a lot easier in terms of how much you're needing to remember and how much you're weighing down sort of your cognitive capacity to remember things, your short-term memory. I think that's sort of probably a twofold way of looking at it, which might then also make more people prone to trying it out. I do think what you mentioned, there's lots of wonderful examples. I think the first two that you mentioned as well, in terms of raising awareness and sort of educating yourself and also recognizing that we have these biases in us. We can't really rid ourselves of them, is exactly why we do these episodes. I hope that people listening already sort of start that journey and get to those first few steps. So all the listeners can already sort of tick off the first two. And then you talk a lot about becoming more data driven, using technology or using structured processes if you don't if you can't really afford technological solutions because of budget reasons, then that's also a good way of sort of structuring things, and then relying on other people, sort of third party, as it were, to review your own notes. So I think those are wonderful pieces of advice. With that, we're already at the end of our episode. Thank you so much, Annie, for joining us and walking us through recency bias. Really excited to hear from our listeners as well what they thought of this, whether they'd heard about recency bias or primacy bias. We touched on that a little bit as well.
Would love to hear from you all what you thought, which bias we should cover next as well. And I really hope that you'll tune in 2 weeks' time for a bi-weekly podcast. So do come back for another bias deep dive then. And again, thank you so much, Annie, for joining me on this one.
No worries. Thank you for having me.